Yeah, we're standing again on Mount Sinai here at the summit, and here's a blackened boulder. And we're just looking at it, and if you pull off this piece, inside's a different color. That's kind of pinkish, but the outside's black.
Some stories in the Bible are too familiar. They're told so often we stop hearing them. But buried inside a few of those stories are moments so strange, so unsettling, that when you actually see them for what they are, they hit like a bolt of lightning. This is one of those stories, or rather three men, three confrontations, not with kings or armies or demons, but with God himself. Not in visions, not in dreams, in real, visceral moments of conflict. One wrestled with him in the dirt, one accused him in the ashes, one refused his command face to face. And the shocking truth, in each case, God didn't destroy them. He didn't silence them. He met them where they were and left them marked. Marked in ways no one expected. The first encounter happened under a black sky, by the side of a river that few remember. According to Genesis 32, Jacob was alone. The rest of his camp had crossed the river ahead of him. His wives, his sons, his wealth, all sent forward like offerings before a battle because Jacob knew what was coming. His brother Esau was approaching, and the last time they'd seen each other, Esau had vowed to kill him. Jacob had made a life out of survival. He stole blessings, manipulated inheritance, and escaped every trap he set for others. But now, alone at the river's edge, his usual weapons, wit, charm, control, were useless. The night was silent. No animals stirred. The wind didn't blow. And that's when it happened. A figure stepped into the clearing. No words, no warning, just presence. They collided. What followed wasn't a vision. It wasn't symbolic. It was a brawl. The stranger fought with impossible precision, meeting Jacob's every move, resisting but never overwhelming him. They locked arms, twisted limbs, fell, and rose again. Jacob didn't know who he was fighting, but instinct screamed it wasn't just a man. Hours passed, the moon moved, neither surrendered. Then, just before dawn, the stranger touched Jacob's hip. Not punched, not struck, just touched, and it broke. Jacob collapsed, and the joint dislocated instantly. He couldn't stand, he couldn't fight, but he clung because somehow he knew this figure wasn't just powerful, he was holy. And here's the shocking truth. This wasn't a test of strength, it was a test of surrender. And Jacob failed because he didn't let go. Even after his body gave out, even after he knew who he was touching, he refused to release. And still, he wasn't punished. He was renamed from Jacob, the deceiver, to Israel, the one who wrestles with God. But the price was permanent. He limped away from that encounter, and he limped for the rest of his life. The scar was the proof he had fought with God and survived, but he walked away wounded, and that wound became part of his legacy. The nation named after him still bears that mark, a name not of triumph, but of struggle. And that is the shocking part. God allowed himself to be grappled with, resisted, even clung to by a man whose life was built on manipulation, and instead of crushing him, he gave him a new name and a broken hip, one to honor him, the other to humble him. But Jacob wasn't the only man to face God and walk away altered. Long before that riverbank ever ran red with sweat and dust, there lived a man who didn't fight God with his hands, but with something even more dangerous: his words. His name was Job. According to the ancient text that bears his name, Job was a man of great wealth, stature, and spiritual devotion. The kind of person people looked at and said, that's what righteousness looks like. He had land, livestock, a large family, everything anyone could want, until the ground dropped out from under him. It started with a messenger, then another. Raiders slaughtered his servants. Fire consumed his flocks. A building collapsed on his sons and daughters. One after another, each part of his life was stripped away with surgical cruelty. And if that wasn't enough, his body soon erupted in open sores. He sat in ashes, scraping his skin with broken pottery. His name, once respected, became synonymous with tragedy. His friends came not with help, but with accusations. Maybe he deserved it, maybe he had sinned in secret. They spoke in riddles and doctrines, trying to make sense of what had happened. But Job didn't retreat. He did something most people would never dare. He spoke directly to God, not with reverence, but with defiance. He demanded answers. He challenged the justice of it all. He asked why the innocent suffer, why the wicked thrive, why heaven had gone silent when hell had opened its mouth. And heaven stayed silent until it didn't. As the story goes, a storm rolled in, not metaphorical, real, furious. And from within it, God finally answered, but not the way anyone expected, because here's the shocking truth. God didn't comfort him. He didn't explain himself, didn't offer an apology or rationale. Instead, he unleashed a torrent of questions so vast, so cosmic, that Job was left speechless. The message was clear. You asked to speak to me, now look at me. And Job folded. Not because he got what he wanted, but because he realized just how little he understood. But the ending is where the real shock lies. God didn't condemn Job for speaking the way he did. In fact, when the smoke cleared, it was Job, not his friends, who was commended. His honesty, his raw grief, his refusal to pretend, it was all honored. And what's more, the same God who confronted him in the storm restored him afterward, double what was lost. But the memory of that confrontation never left. Job had seen the storm behind the silence, and the truth of that encounter still echoes that sometimes the ones who scream at heaven are heard more clearly than the ones who whisper from a distance. That's where we'll pause for now. The final man to wrestle with God didn't meet him in the dark. There was no midnight struggle by a river, no cries into silence from the ruins of a lost life. This confrontation happened in broad daylight, in fire, in command, on holy ground where sandals couldn't stay on feet and words burned before they were even spoken. This was Moses. By the time God called to him, Moses was already broken. He had been raised in Pharaoh's palace, a Hebrew child, adopted by royalty, trained in the ways of empire. But the fracture inside him grew. One day, seeing a Hebrew slave beaten by an Egyptian, Moses snapped. He killed the Egyptian, buried the body, and ran. He fled not just Egypt, but identity, calling, and consequence. He tried to disappear. For 40 years, he lived in exile in Midian, far from the corridors of power, far from the story he was born into. He married, became a shepherd, and settled into anonymity. Whatever flame had once burned in him had long since cooled to ash. And then one day, he saw something strange, a bush engulfed in flame, but not consumed. It drew him in, not just curiosity, something deeper, the sense that this fire wasn't of this world. As he approached, the ground itself shifted. A voice, ancient, commanding, alive, rose from within the flame and called his name. The God of his ancestors had seen the suffering of Israel, had heard their cries in Egypt, and now he was sending Moses to deliver them. But instead of falling in awe, Moses stepped backward. What followed wasn't a moment of holy acceptance. It was a fight, not with fists, but with fear, with protest, with resistance so raw it echoed Jacob's grip and Job's questions in a different form. He gave every excuse. What if they don't believe me? What if I'm not eloquent? What if I say the wrong thing? Who am I to lead anyone? Each objection was met with assurance. Each fear was answered. Signs were offered, promises made. God told him, I will be with you. And still, Moses resisted. He asked for someone else to go. Anyone but him. Here was a man standing before God, not metaphorically, not in a dream, but in real time, hearing the voice of the Almighty, seeing a miracle unfold before his eyes, and still saying no. And yet, God didn't walk away. He didn't crush him. His anger burned, yes, but he adjusted. Aaron, Moses' brother, would speak on his behalf. The mission would continue. Moses would go, but the reluctance didn't disappear. It would follow him, quietly, like a shadow, for the rest of his life. And so he returned to Egypt, not as a prince, but as a prophet, with a staff, a stutter, and the weight of a divine calling that never fully settled on his shoulders. He faced Pharaoh, performed signs, called down plagues, led his people through parted waters, through nights lit by fire, through hunger and rebellion. And all along he spoke with God, on mountaintops, in tents, in silence, in fury. He pleaded for his people more than once. When they built the golden calf, when they doubted, when they threatened to return to slavery, he stood between their failure and God's justice, arguing their case with a trembling voice. He begged God to stay with them, even when they didn't deserve it. And each time he was heard. There is a beauty in that, a man who once resisted God, now pleading with that same God not to abandon others. It's as if the fight that began in the bush had shaped something permanent in him. Not rebellion, not defiance, but a kind of intimacy forged through friction. But the most shocking moment came much later, after decades in the desert, after all the obedience and leadership, after facing the weight of a complaining people and a crushing responsibility. The people asked for water. Again, God told Moses, "Speak to the rock." But Moses, tired, angry, worn down, did something else. He struck it. Twice. Water came, but so did the consequence. God told Moses he would not enter the promised land. It seems harsh, after everything, after the fight, the faith, the sacrifices, but there it was. He would see the land from a distance, but never walk in it. And that's how his story ends. Moses climbed Mount Nebo, the wilderness stretched behind him, the promise unfolded before him, but he would not cross. He died there, alone with God. And according to the ancient account, God himself buried him in a valley no one could find, a grave hidden by heaven. It's a moment so heavy it almost defies interpretation. The man who spoke with God as a friend, the man who argued, resisted, pleaded, and led, the man whose life was one long wrestling match with divine will, never entered the promise. And yet, that grave was not the end. Centuries later, when Jesus stood on the Mount of Transfiguration, shining in glory, it was Moses, alongside Elijah, who appeared beside him. Not forgotten, not cast aside, not punished, but part of something deeper, something eternal. And that may be the most haunting truth of all. Jacob fought and limped away with a new name. Job accused and was answered with a storm. Moses resisted and died just short of the promise. None of them were destroyed. Each was transformed. That's what's so shocking. God didn't avoid the fight. He met them in it, matched them, answered them, and in doing so, reshaped them. But none walked away unchanged. The limp, the silence, the mountain, these were not punishments. They were marks, echoes of divine collision, the cost of stepping into something too big to control. And maybe that's the truth buried in all three stories, that the wrestling with God isn't the opposite of faith. Sometimes it's the proof of it, but it always leaves a scar. If this opened something in you, if it made you look twice at stories you thought you knew, then you're exactly who Faith Face is for. This channel exists to peel back the layers, to tell the strange, powerful stories hiding in the margins of Scripture. So if you're drawn to those mysteries, subscribe, and in the comments, tell us, what's the most haunting story in the Bible you've ever read? Until next time, stay prayerful.